Hi 6-7s, this is a video number 2 of some math help for the math that was posted on Tuesday, April 7th. There were 2 main slides that were provided. One was for 6s and 7s, and it was a fraction, decimal, and percent review, and I've made a video for that. And this is the fraction and decimal patterns, which was intended for 7s, but 6s, if you want to play along, feel free to as well. So I will be posting this sometime on Wednesday, so feel free to use the rest of the time on Wednesday and Thursday to get your math finished up, because it was a little bit tricky and we've been out of practice. So I'm going to kind of go slide by slide on my side and just explain kind of what's going on so you have an idea of how to fill this out. So this is all talking about something called a unit fraction, right? So a unit tends to mean something that's 1. So a unit fraction is any fraction that has 1 at the top. So 1/4, 1/3, 1/9. They're all considered to be unit fractions because they can be, they're the basis or the building blocks of the rest of the fractions. Okay, so a unit fraction is just anything where the numerator is a 1. And we can use these unit fractions and we can add them up. So we know that 3/8 as a fraction is really 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8. Right? We know that there are 3 unit fractions that will add up to equal 3/8. So if you have the question 3/5, and we need to make an addition statement with unit fractions, then we know that this is going to be 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5. Okay, easy enough. So unit fraction, again, is literally just a fraction with a 1 in the numerator. And then these unit fractions can be added up to make any number of fractions that you need. All right, so that's the basis of our work for today. So we also know that fractions can equal percent, or decimals rather. So if I go back to that fraction of 3/5, using my unit fractions, I know that 3/5 really means 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5. Now I can also take my fifths and I can translate those into decimals. So I know that 1/5 equals 0.2. It's just something that you're going to have to really memorize to know that 1/5 is 0.2 or 20%. The more you see it, the more you'll know about it, right? But for now, we're just going to be content to know that 1/5 is 0.2. So that means that each of these unit fractions can actually equal 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2. And now we can actually really easily add them up. 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2 equals 0.6. So now I can see how 3/5 equals 0.6. Let's do another example. The next example is 3/4. So let's write our original up here, 3/4. And now let's break it down into our unit fractions. 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. So now I know that that is 3/4. 1/4 as a visual reminder, 1/4 as a decimal, oops, let me write that so you can see it better. 1/4 as a decimal is 0.25. So if I go back to our original equation with our unit fractions, I can exchange our unit fraction of 1/4 for 0.25 plus 0.25 plus 0.25. And if I want to do a stack and add of that, I can. If I want to use a calculator, I can. But I know that 0.25 plus 0.25 plus 0.25 is 0.75. So that also tells me that 3/4 is the equivalent decimal of 0.75. It's kind of cool. Unit fractions are very helpful. All right, so that will get you through page 3 and 4. Now, we can add all of these up, or we can start to multiply them, and that's going to help us. So this one asks us to write the fraction as a multiplication of the unit fraction and the whole number. So we're going to go back to our example of, oh, no, sorry. This example is 4/5. So our example on the page is 4/5. So I could do 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5. And I know that my unit fraction is 0.2. 1/5 equals 0.2. So I could write it 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2. Or, being a smart grade 6/7, I know that I need 4 of them. And I can multiply that by 0.2 on a calculator or a stack and multiply, and I can get myself 0.8. So it's exactly what we were doing on the first slide, except we're using smarter math for grade 7 and discovering that I can multiply instead of add. Okay, so let's try the next question on the page. The next question says 3/4. So for 3/4, I could do 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. But I know that since 1/4 is 0.25 and I need 3 of them, I can just multiply it like that. And if I use my calculator, or I can do the stack and multiply, I know that 3 times 0.25 is 0.75. That tells me that 3/4 is the decimal equivalent of 0.75. Okay? Let's do one more example because the next question gets a bit tricky. The next question says 5/2. Now this is an improper fraction because the numerator is on top, is bigger than the denominator. And most of the time fractions don't like to be this way, but in this case it doesn't really matter because we're simply going to change it into a decimal. So I know that I need the unit for this would be 1/2. The unit fraction is 1/2, and I would need 5 of these, but rather than, so I could do 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2. But I know that the decimal equivalent of 1/2 is 0.5. Half of a whole is 0.5. And I need 5 of them, so I'm going to times this by 5. And I could use a calculator or a stack and multiply. And I could get the answer of 2.5. Because this time I have more than a whole. So my answer is going to require a whole number here and not a decimal. So let's see if you can try 7/5 on your own doing it that way. And that should cover slide number 5. For slide number 6, if it's giving us a pattern and showing us that we know that 1/20, if I was to find the decimal equivalent to that, it was 0.05. 2/20 equals 0.10. 3/20 would be what? If you can see the pattern, we can figure out that it's basically counting by fives. 5/100ths, then a tenth, and then this is going to be 0.15. That's easy enough. But let's say we want to know what 11/20 is. I don't want to have to continue the pattern all the way down. So I'm going to use that multiplication strategy that I learned on the last slide. So if I want to know what 11/20 is, then I know that 1/20 equals 0.05. Therefore, I want 11 of them times 0.05. And that is going to get me, if I use a calculator or a stack and multiply, I can get 0.55. So as long as we know this unit fraction up here, multiply it by the number of unit fractions we need, we can get our answer here in a decimal. That is slide number 6. So the same thing is going to happen now for slide number 7. So it's saying to me, if I know that 1/4 equals 0.25, and I want to know 3/4, I'm going to do 0.25 times 3. And I'll be able to get 0.75. Easy enough. But what if we want 7/4? So again, this is an improper fraction because my numerator is bigger. So I'm going to definitely have some whole numbers here. I know that 1/4 equals 0.25, and I want 7 of those. So I'm going to do 7 times 0.25. And if I use a calculator or a stack and multiply, I should get 1.75 because I need 7 of these 0.25s. So there's 2 more questions on the page, number 7, that you can try. All right, so we know how to add fractions with like denominators. If we have 3/7 plus 4/7, as long as the denominators are the same, the denominator here in our answer is the same, and I simply need to add the top. In this case, I get 7/7. The same thing can apply if I have a 1/5 plus a 2/5. As long as the denominators are the same, it comes across, and I can add the top, 3/5. It does get a bit trickier when the denominators are different, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. But here's something else you can do. You can change the fractions into a decimal, then add the decimals. So that's what it's asking you to do on slide 8. So the example is 1/4 plus 2/5. So I should stop here and briefly explain that if I want to find the decimal of this, and I don't know that 1/4 equals 0.25, if I take the top divided by the bottom of any fraction, it will give me the decimal equivalent. So if I put into my calculator 1 divided by 4, the answer would be 0.25. There are some fraction and decimal equivalents you're just going to want to memorize. But the standard rule is top 2 divided by bottom 5 into a calculator will get you a decimal. So it's pretty tricky adding up fractions with unlike denominators. And we talk a little bit more about that again next week. But this way is really a sort of a fun way to do it. So I change each of the fractions into its decimal equivalent by using top divided by bottom on a calculator. Then I just simply need to add these two decimals. And I'm going to just do a quick stack and add. Notice when I stack and add decimals that my decimals are lined up, and then I simply add as I normally would, bringing the decimal down straight. So this is 0.65. So 1/4 plus 2/5 is actually 0.65, or as we learned last week, or yesterday rather, we can make that 65 over 100 if we want to put it back into a fraction. All right, there's one more question on there. So that gives you, that kind of explains page 8. So then let's try some of them on page 9. It is 1/2 and 4/5 is our question. 1/2 plus 4/5. So normally, because they are unlike denominators, I would have to find common denominators. And that can take a little bit more time. So instead, I'm going to turn them into decimals and then add them. So to find the decimal equivalent of a fraction, I can always, if I don't know them off by heart, I can do the top of the fraction divided by the bottom of the fraction. So if I did into my calculator, 1 divided by 2, I would get the decimal of 0.5. If I did 4 divided by 5 into my calculator, I would get a decimal of 0.8. Now I can add those two together, and I'm going to do a stack and add. All right, I'm going to do a stack and add, so you can see I've got my decimals lined up, and I just need to add 5 plus 8 is 13, so I carry the 1, bring down the 3, decimal comes straight down, and I have 1 plus 0 is 1. So this is actually more than a whole. So my answer, I could go back up to the top and I could write 1.3, but if I want it as a fraction, I'm going to have to write it as 1 3/10, because this 0.3, if I say it 1.3, I could also say it 1 3/10. So I want to turn it back into a fraction. So there's 2 more questions that you can try and answer on that page, which is page 9. And that's it. Okay, so remember, when you're turning fractions into decimals, if I have 3/10 and I want to turn that into a decimal, I'm going to take the top divided by the bottom on a calculator, and that's going to give me a fraction or a decimal. Okay, so I hope that helps. It's actually pretty easy once you get a hold of it and you understand what's going on. The examples I made here in this video match the examples on the slideshow, so that should be able to help you a lot. Okay? Thanks very much. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.